Okay, I think in the interest of time, we will get going. So welcome everybody to our webinar and welcome also to the team here from Profit. We'll introduce ourselves. I'm Helen Rose Thorne, partner and co-lead of our organisation and culture practice here, based out of London. And my partner in crime, fellow co-lead is Tony, and I'll let him and the rest of the team introduce themselves.
It's a pleasure to be with you today. My name is Tony Frost. As Helen said, I have the great honor to be her co-lead in our organization and culture practice. And I'm speaking to you today from my summer home in Reykjavik, where I relocated for the summer.
I can go next. Hi, everyone. I'm Amanda Bala. I'm an associate partner with Profit, part of our organization and culture practice. I'm really excited that you've joined us today, and I am joining you all today from New York. And over to Erin.
Hello, Erin Myers, also stateside in New York, just a few blocks north of Amanda, and I am a senior associate, also, not surprisingly, part of our organization and culture practice.
So let me tell you just a teeny weeny bit about Profit, but also it contextualizes the work that we're going to share with you today as well. We're a consulting firm of almost 600 people in 12, almost 13 offices around the world. And what we do is help our clients navigate transformation to deliver uncommon growth. Unprecedented is a word that was used and has been used a great deal in the last 18 months. And even before the events of 2020, we were seeing unprecedented levels of change and disruption. And then obviously many forces elevated those to a whole new level in the last 18 months. And our aim in our consulting firm is to help our clients both see and realize transformative opportunities to deliver uncommon growth. We ask 4 key questions in our organization and culture platform to help our clients do just this. So we help them answer questions like, how might we define and harness a compelling purpose to drive performance? How might we develop a culture that thrives on change and is resilient? How might we build and sustain capabilities to win in a digital world? And how might we transform our organization to power growth? Those questions, I think, will all come to the fore in the content that we've got for you through the next hour. And our agenda today will be to bring you, those who aren't familiar with the work we've been doing over the last 3 years around what we call catalysts. So bring you up to speed on culture as a catalyst, more relevant than ever, and then share with you the work that we've done through the latest set of global research to really examine the unprecedented external forces that we've experienced and their impact on the future of work, and then look more deeply into how that leads to the questions of resilience building and fitness for change in this future ahead of us. So as we go into our session, please do use the Q&A function to submit any thoughts or questions you have along the way, and we'll address them later on during the webinar. As you will have seen, we've got a final Q&A section that we hope to have time and intend to have time to talk through. And you'll see it at the bottom bar of your screen on the right-hand side. You should see that Q&A function. But before we dive into the content, whilst everybody obviously registers for a webinar like this, and we do get a little bit of information and insight into participants that way, we'd love to learn a bit more about this group. So here is a little poll. We work in Profit across all of these functions and many more audiences within our clients, but we'd love if you could just give us a bit of insight into which department or function you most directly support. It's a single choice. Always good to get a picture of who's on the line with us. So I don't know, Nicola, who's supporting us, if you can see any pattern emerging. There we go. So there we go, strategy and HR. Transaction strategy from Caroline, thank you. with some marketing, operations, and a smattering of digital and IT. Thank you. Great to see that spread. Okay, let me set the scene for a few minutes before I hand over to colleagues on catalysts and what we mean by that, actually. So given the work which we do, we understand very directly that transformation efforts in organizations often struggle to gain traction. We see some patterns that play out in organizations: a rush to the technology, a rush to something new without understanding where and how it fits in, allowing people to see the direction of travel and the role new ways of working, new technologies and digitization plays. Underinvestment in leadership alignment, particularly in the middle of organizations, it's seen to be typically a vast audience, time consuming, a lot of numbers, and too difficult. And then there's the habit that organizations seem to have around fixating on the barriers and challenges and being too concerned, if you want, to address those rather than actually looking at the small steps of progress that are being made and celebrating those. That triggers a whole load of issues, and unfortunately the outcome is nothing sustainable changes. So one of the, well, in fact, the guiding construct that we work with in our organisation and culture practice is our human-centered transformation model. We see the organisation as a macrocosm of the individual. So the organisation has DNA, mind, body, and soul. And all these aspects work together in one cultural ecosystem. And by these four elements, what we mean is DNA as the definition or the codification of the destination of travel. We talk to soul as the beliefs, the rituals, the symbols that aid motivation and help ignite belief. We talk about the mind, the skills and capabilities required on a change journey. And we also talk about body, that directs, if you want, the ecosystem of the human-centered transformation model, because it talks about the systems, the operating model, the processes needed to change. We have set out over the last 3 years to work with this model to understand how you work in a culture system, what levers that you really need to grasp to actually drive successful transformation in our digital world. In 2019, we did our first major piece of global research, and it identified 11 levers of cultural change through this lens of human-centered transformation. 6 levers that we call fundamentals, the table stakes, and stated most important levers for culture. And then the accelerators, the hidden levers of change that often combine with the fundamentals to drive that added impact. So an example here would be within fundamentals of a clear, transparent, living roadmap for transformation, which when you then combine with a powerful, actionable ambition as an accelerator, you can see how those two would absolutely reinforce one another. That was L29 Research. And then in 2020, and by the way, you can download all of this research from the Profit website. But then in 2020, we went back again globally to leaders around the world and looked at the pathways that organizations were taking through the human-centered transformation model in service of change and transformation. And we found actually that change focus areas aligned very much to the 4 elements of the human-centered transformation model, linked to the perceptions of what the primary cultural roadblock to be tackled was. So for example, in enabling the transformation, very often that was beginning the pathway through the model with a focus on talent systems and talent strategies, often addressing legacy talent models. So what about 2021? Obviously, we came towards the end of 2020, like most people, having traveled through times nobody could surely have predicted. And it felt to us that it was really important to consider the human-centered transformation model in the context of the societal forces that we experienced in 2020 and believe will shape transformation in years to come. And actually, the consequences of that around resilience and fitness for change, and how we could combine both a perspective on fitness for change with the levers or the catalyst levers we've identified over the last 3 years. And that's what we were set out to address in our 2021 work. And like the previous 2 years, we went to 4 countries/regions. We went to the United States, United Kingdom, Germany, and China. We had a good covering across industry sectors, size of organizations, and but it was a pretty senior audience, as it has been through our work for the last 3 years. We started with executive qualitative interviews and took our hypotheses to a quantitative survey with almost 500 participants globally. And so what we see are 3 highlights, and my colleagues and co-authors will take you through these in the rest of the webinar. We saw that indeed, and we all know it, there was seismic change, but the aftershocks are going to be with us and will shape transformation for years to come. We've also tested and validated a new perspective on what being change fit really means and what it builds in terms of organizational resilience and ability to respond to multiple forces of impact rather than one single powerful one. And then how we evolve our capacity, thinking about human-centered transformation and change fitness in a more holistic context. So with no more ado, I will hand over to Erin.
Excellent. Thank you, Helen. So in this next chunk of time, what we'd love to do is spend a little bit of time unpacking and understanding what we've referred to as these external forces that we've been studying. But we'll also dig into these, what we're calling future areas of focus that we believe are going to help increase an organization's readiness for this future working landscape that's been influenced very, very strongly and will continue to be influenced by these forces. So to briefly set just a little bit of context before we dig into the data that's actually on the slide, most leaders reported remote working, employee well-being, mental health, and economic slowdown as the top 3 most influential forces in rank order that sort of drove cultural change for their organizations in 2020. We might not find that entirely surprising, having lived it ourselves. What was really interesting is what's on the page here, which is that, a little more than a year later, we see that these forces have already shifted the landscape, but it's going to continue. So those aftershocks that Helen was just referencing, we find that leaders believe that most forces are actually going to increase in importance over the next few years. And if we tick down the list 1 through 6, it's not just technological shifts that leaders are needing to prepare for, right? It's remote work and climate change, environmental sustainability, stakeholder capitalism, social justice activism, is all going to impact organizations for years to come, not just 2020. So when we ask leaders to think, what might need to be true about your organization moving forward to live in an environment impacted by those 6 forces? And we uncovered what I referred to as the future areas of focus that would sort of increase an organization's ability to thrive in this type of environment. So the 3 are conscious commitment, empowering talent experiences, and dynamic ways of working. And we'll take a closer look at each of these on the following pages, both in the context of our research, but also knowing that it was fielded earlier this spring. We've kept an eye on these themes in the market, both in other research and other reports that have been published, to just sort of see where the momentum is heading. And we found a lot of complementary findings that we've brought in to discuss today as we think about the future of work. So this first theme is about making conscious commitments. So I think we've seen the growing importance of an organization's need to really focus on and be accountable to multiple stakeholder groups. It's no longer sufficient to just post really strong returns for your shareholders. DE&I, well-being, mental health, sustainability, these have all become central how a lot of organizations have to operate. And what we're finding is that the focus and dedication and focused efforts against these priorities in 2020 are the new baseline. So employees and the communities alike believe this needs to just be where we're starting from, and we continue to increase our focus and our results against these areas. So within this theme, I think there's been a handful of pieces written about what's been referred to as the Great Resignation, where data is showing from an internal perspective large percentages of employees who are considering or have already left their company. And what's interesting is that there's been studies saying, why, what's driving that? And what one study has found is that culture and purpose is actually the #1 catalyst for an employee choosing to leave their job in this semi-post-pandemic world. And what we've seen more and more, right, is that employees, they're just really trying to understand what team they're playing for, who's on the field with them, what's the end game, what's the goal? And probably most importantly, if we lose the sports metaphor, do the organization's values align with their own as an individual? And if that connective tissue is lacking or missing, that's when an employee is actually seeking a fresh start. If we turn our attention to the second area of focus, this is about empowering talent experiences. And so this is where we start to focus a little bit more on creating relevant and value employee experiences, but importantly, that are evolving over time to create both better well-being and greater productivity. And we saw in our research that this could be achieved by certainly increasing flexibility for where, how, and when work is completed. We saw it in creating mechanisms to instill greater autonomy for teams, but also individual contributors. And what really popped in our research this year, a little bit more so than the previous, was the need to invest in employee upskilling or reskilling to help individuals feel, equipped and fit for this new working environment. So when we think about, promoting greater well-being and productivity, like I was just talking about, we see that flexibility and learning are really central to how an employee is thinking about their own future. So if you look at studies done with HR directors, there's been a couple findings that they believe that sort of the most important thing their organization can do to attract and retain talent is making sure they've got the latest collaborative technology in place to enable greater, more agile learning. That's an HR director's perspective. And what we find, as you see on the screen, is that employees are actually validating that, saying that is something that they're seeking as they think about changing jobs in this new environment. And I would just say that something I find interesting in this particular theme is that where productivity may have been defined previously as outcomes and tasks and being able to accomplish all that and check off a to-do list, it's now probably needs to be more inclusive of collaboration, learning opportunities, well-being, but also this idea of autonomy and flexibility. So it's an expanded definition in the new environment. And then our third area of focus is about dynamic ways of working. This one is really all about finding ways to bring the benefits of a digital work environment to life as we move sort of beyond what was called, the global work from home experiment. And I think some of these benefits of a digital environment would include, and we heard this in our qual and our quant, that there was less hierarchy or hierarchical behavior, at least. There was more interaction across levels and teams, so a little bit of breaking down silos. But there's also a feeling of increased preparedness to actually pivot to a new business model in future times of crisis, rather than sort of bunkering down to protect the core. What does that really look like in practice? Well, we can take a look at some additional findings since we've published our research, which is first to acknowledge that I think in the pandemic, not 100% of all employees were remote. There were certainly organizations that had essential workers still on site or physically in an office or a work environment. And so that was the hybrid style. And as we start to emerge from the tumult that was last year, what studies are finding is that employees really want the best of both worlds. There are some studies that have, over 70% of employees wanting flexible work options to continue. There's over 60% of employees who want more collaboration. They're craving in-person time. So what do you do with that? Well, what we're showing here is that the majority of business decision makers and leaders are saying, okay, well, we need to prepare our physical spaces to better accommodate a hybrid working style. How do you facilitate meetings, brainstorming, decision-making in that type of environment? And that's all well and good, but I think this theme is bigger than just physical space, right? So when we think about transitioning to remote or hybrid working, when it happened overnight, I think a lot of businesses, organizations tried to find a way for, to slap a digital platform over the way we've always done something and just continue with business as usual as best as they could. And that got many of us through, the past year. But now what's really exciting is there's an opportunity to actually really think critically about where is digital or digital tools better suited than in person or other ways that we've always done things to have more productivity or more efficient work as we move forward. And so that was sort of the lightning round of the forces and future areas of focus. But Amanda's actually going to share a perspective on how leaders can execute against these areas by building the resilience that Helen started nudging towards and building and developing what we call fitness for future change.
Excellent. Thanks, Erin. And we wanted to get started by actually hearing from you and understanding what you're seeing today as the biggest barrier to change within your organization. So we're launching a poll, and you'll see a few choices here. So are you facing today, in terms of your barriers, a lack of cross-functional coordination, lack of understanding the need for managing organizational change? Are you seeing lack of leadership alignment? Is there an overemphasis on technology as a solution rather than the role of people? Or lack of connection between individual change initiatives and broader strategic goals? Or maybe something else. And if something else, we'd love to see that in the chat as well. So take a moment, select what you think is the biggest barrier, and then we'll take a look at the results. All right, well, we're definitely seeing a mix across the different barriers. It looks like the biggest one from this group is lack of connection between individual change initiatives, and then pretty close to a tie, I'd say, in terms of leadership alignment, overemphasis on technology, cross-functional coordination. I also saw in the chat someone mentioned lack of alignment across silos due to conflicting incentives, kind of hitting on a few of these barriers. Great. Well, we wanted to get a sense of, where this group was at, and we asked a very similar question in our research. So specifically, which of these factors do you believe will hold your organization back from change? And we had tested, it was a list of over 15 barriers, and these were the 5 that rose to the top. These were the same 5 that we just shared with you in the poll. And what was interesting to us is actually what didn't rise to the top. The barriers that, fell closer to the bottom of the list, we saw were those that were actually more related to the tactics of change. Things like not having the tools and methods that are needed, or measurement approaches being perhaps too narrow or too inconsistent. What was interesting about those that rose to the top, the 5 that we're looking at here, is this is really about the people dimension of change. So leaders not being aligned around where the change is heading, for instance, or the organization not working effectively together against the change. And it really, for us, reinforced something that we've talked about in our practice for a while, which is that businesses don't change. It's really humans that change, and then humans change the business. And so it's really critical for organizations to help their employees get comfortable with change. But when we looked at, the very dynamic environment that Erin just spoke through, our belief is that a traditional change management playbook is not sufficient to really help organizations navigate that. So to talk in a bit more detail about how we began to evolve our point of view, when we looked at traditional change management approaches, these are ones that look at change as an obstacle or a single milestone. And once you reach that, you complete it, you check the box, you're done, and there's a view that things will turn back to normal. And as we've all learned over the past 18 months or so, that idea of normal really doesn't exist anymore. And certainly companies had begun to evolve from this, more transactional view of change management, especially organizations who are undergoing digital transformation. They really had to look at change in a much more multifaceted way. So change is a journey, one with multiple milestones, and this certainly represented progress. But again, if we think about the ongoing technological shifts, as well as how organizations will continue to grapple with a very dynamic macro environment, we believe that a more transformational approach to change management is what's needed. one that really proactively embraces a growth mindset and in which organizations and individuals are equipped to thrive. And so this is what we wanted to talk about today, really how to build your organization's muscle for change and increase something that we're calling change fitness. And it's really like any muscle where the more we practice, the more we exercise it, the stronger we get. And so we set out in our research to really develop and validate a model for what it looks like to increase an organization's change fitness. So you can see here that it moves from that more transactional approach to change management to one that's more transformational, and truly seeing change as an obstacle on the left-hand side to change on the right-hand side really more as a sport, something where the organization thrives on the challenge of change and it's seen as really positive and exciting. So let's talk through each of 5 ascending levels of change fitness and what it looks like for an organization to increase along these. So in the first one, as mentioned, change is seen as an obstacle. So new situations arise, these are perceived as a threat, and they create some stress or anxiety. When you move to level 2, this is where change is a milestone to be celebrated. So there is a more positive orientation, but there's still this lingering desire for things to get back to the way that they were. When organizations move to level 3, this is where change fitness begins to build. So transformation is seen as something exciting. There's something better at the end of the journey. It brings growth, it brings abundance. And this is also where we begin to see organizations taking more of a human-centered approach to transformation. Those elements of DNA, mind, body, and soul that Helen spoke through earlier, leaders really begin becoming more intentional about those elements and how they work together holistically. When we move to level 4, this is where the pace of change starts to quicken. So individuals begin to get kind of pushed toward the edge of what they thought was possible and moving into more of a flow state. So actions and awareness of those actions being more in sync with one another, and the organization really feeling as if it has clarity on how to move forward. And then finally, level 5, where change is a state of play. So here the organization is thriving on change, it's embraced a growth mindset, and there's a view that change actually creates opportunities for us to excel, both individually and collectively. So these are the 5 levels of change fitness. And for each of these, there's an imperative for the organization, for leaders, for teams, and for individual contributors. And so this isn't something that just leaders need to worry about, or that can get pushed down to individual contributors and they're the ones who push forward on it. It's really important that all parts of the organization are in sync in terms of collectively driving forward on the change. So now I'm going to turn it over to Tony to go through the model in a bit more detail and discuss some ways and best practices that your organization can build your change fitness.
Thank you, Amanda. So let's start at the organizational level. If we look at what the end goal is, there's an acceptance that the uncertainty that we see now and change and volatility is reality. And so we need to learn to thrive on the proactive and continuous change of the modern world. And that leads to an ability to embrace experimentation. And there's a lovely quote here from Faye Whitmarsh, one of our friends in the UK at Nationwide Building Society, about the work that they've done to understand experimentation and see it as the best way to get the culture to change, to experientially learn their way forward, do small, precise tests, and build that into a way of being as an organization. This is something that we've seen is incredibly important right now, both in pandemic and post-pandemic, is organizations getting comfortable with small and low fidelity experimentation, moving quickly to high fidelity as they get signals from the market that that experiment is working. If you were to say that innovation is the lifeblood of a growing business, then one might say that experimentation is where that innovation comes from, that innovation is in and of itself a process of disciplined, continuous experimentation. And so the firms who are working at the highest level of resilience have embraced experimentation from top to bottom as a necessary way to get real-time signals from the market, as opposed to studying the problem for 18 months and then trying a solution too late. So that's the organizational view. Let's drill down a little bit and take a look at what it means for leaders to live in that world. So at the highest level of change fitness, what we see is leaders who've learned, as Molly Graham says, to give away their Legos. And what that means is that we don't get attached and sit like Smog the dragon on top of our organizational treasure, guarding our authority and the capabilities that we've built, but we are willing and ready to let those go and hand those responsibilities to others as new opportunities arise to build new and different capabilities. And as it happens, just today, I was having a rather remarkable conversation with a really special leader in the world of healthcare, someone who's a real visionary, has been working hard to change healthcare for the rest of us for quite some time. And their organization is actively looking at creating new business models, and part of that comes through acquisition. And so one of the questions that he asked me this morning is, how might I think about the next few months with all of this happening? Because he spent so much time building internal capabilities. And we had this conversation about getting comfortable with the idea of what you've built is wonderful. It can now be operationalized and run by other people. We're about to onboard a whole bunch of new capabilities, and they're likely to really need your leadership. He's someone who I see as the moral center of healthcare. And his willingness to let go of his Legos is a great opportunity for them to grow and also for him to grow personally as they expand into new businesses. So that's a little bit about what it means to be a leader and being really change fit and resilient. Let's take a look at the team level. Similar to what happens with leaders, with teams, people get stuck functionally. And so increased change fitness means being able to work in more of a multidisciplinary team and also to add new disciplines into that group as needed. There's a wonderful quote here from Daniel McNamara at USAA, which is a wonderful sort of leading indicator of how to change your organization by changing teams. They actually pivoted their entire operating model to focus on the military service people that they service and to organize themselves by journey as opposed to the functional organization they had before by product. That's been a dramatic transformation in their business. As I reflect on the work that we do in the field with our clients right now, and someone said that in 2020, every CEO became a transformation CEO, and it certainly does feel like that. A lot of what we've employed to break down silos and get clients moving more quickly is a pods and squads model, where squads are capabilities and pods are focused on specific business challenges that need to be addressed right now. And so we pull people out of their silos, put them into cross-functional pods where they're tasked with solving that specific business challenge, and then run them in agile sprints, even though we're not necessarily doing anything to do with software, but dealing with issues of business strategy and creating new products and services where technology will likely enable them. And they're working now in 2-week sprints in cross-functional teams with decision rights pushed down into that team. And that's giving them a sense of what it means to live in the future and be more change resilient and work in flow. Those agile principles are in place. And hopefully, as this becomes fun for them, then they're leading up to that top level of play. Now, at the individual level, this is going to require something of all of us as individual contributors. This means that we have to increase our cross-functional skills and be increasingly T-shaped and not just I-shaped in our capabilities so that we can play different roles in different cross-functional teams. We also need to focus more on business outcomes, and that fluency in multiple disciplines creates a lot more capability for us to participate in different areas as the firm begins to evolve and change at a more rapid pace. And a lovely quote from Lisa Rometty, one of my favorite people in the world, about what she looks for in leaders in her current role as president of kidney care at CVS Health, which is learning agility, because she understands that the ability to learn new capabilities quickly and new skills and apply them in cross-functional teams is what advances the business. It also requires the willingness to accept some failure along the way, reflect on that, and see that as an opportunity for personal growth. So that's a little bit about the model, and hopefully it's given you some inspiration for things that you might do within your organization to help leaders, teams, and individuals begin to become more resilient. Now, one of the most interesting things that came out of this research is that, for us at least, the human-centered transformation model turns out to really remain central to helping a company strengthen its change fitness. So we find that organizations who reported higher change fitness are better able to drive greater volumes of transformation activity. We found that activities focused on employee motivation and enablement were super critical this year, and organizations with higher change fitness helping employees adapt through this was incredibly important to maintaining their health and well-being. We also saw that the fundamentals are associated with higher change fitness. So getting those right means that they really are fundamental for future growth and transformation. And that the top driver of high change fitness is one of our accelerators, which is making clear the direction of travel. Having a powerful future-facing ambition is an incredible aid, catalyst, as we like to say, to being change fit. The last remarkable thing for us was to learn that the companies with the highest change fitness in 2020 also reported the best financial performance of all the companies that we surveyed. And so it really does seem that higher change fitness correlates to higher business performance, which is tremendous. And we were pleased to see that. So I hope that was interesting for all of you. It was fascinating for us. Here's 3 things to leave you with. Setting clear ambition. It's that key accelerator to driving change fitness. So consider something that's specific, time-bound, measurable, and actionable so that people understand where we're going and when we need to be there. Remember to take all of the elements of the model into account. We need to change holistically. No matter how digital organizations are, they are made up of people. And those people need to evolve in a way that's going to create the business of the future. And finally, laying the foundation for greater change fitness means that you really need to focus on the fundamentals that came out of our first research and ignore them, as Helen likes to say, at your peril. So now you've understood a little bit about what we did in 2021. We have a question for you. So what don't you know that you want to know based on everything that you've heard? And there was one question that came up earlier, which I thought we could go back to, which was Matthew Reese asked about, has the completely open office without assigned desks proven to be a failure? Or is there evidence that it supports multiple working styles / needs? So I'm wondering, Helen, Amanda, would either one of you like to take that one on?
Go for it, Tony. It felt like you had strong opinions.
I do have strong opinions, but I want to give one of you an opportunity. Do you have a strong opinion?
Well, all I would say is that no, I don't think it's proven a failure. And all I can say is that the evidence I see of those organisations that Erin referred to earlier, who are being very deliberate about the hybrid working environment, are very much committed to that. If you want, that is part of what that might look like. However, I do think the really critical role that physical working environments are likely to play for so many organizations is that human collaboration piece. And I think the sort of passing through of people and workspace is something that organizations are going to, are already trying to manage. I mean, it's very difficult right now because we are not free from the constraints that we've been managing for 18 months. But I think the search for human collaboration in working environments is which was actually coming before the pandemic, but I think has been massively heightened as a result of what we've experienced, what we've seen, and what people are thirsting for going forward. My view, Tony, Amanda, I don't know if you want to build on that.
I'll just say one of my colleagues, Paul, has shared something in the chat, which is a fun read if anyone gets the time. It would be clear to you if you read it. So it's an ode to my office chair. And so certainly I was very fond of Profit's New York office and excited to get back to it where we do work in an open plan office. And so when I reflect on, some of the key behaviors and the areas of focus for organizations going forward that are really important, I can point to ways that, at least in my experience, the open plan office has helped with those. So things like reducing hierarchical behaviors where, our partners used to have offices and then everyone was sitting in the same open plan. And then related to the change fitness models, the ways of experimenting in cross-functional teams, for us, it was really wherever you wanted to sit down that day. And there were lots of opportunities to kind of listen to conversations, hear new ideas, learn about new things that colleagues were working on that, in our more traditional kind of organization design and the teams that we're working with, we might not be exposed to. So certainly have some personal experience that I think points to the benefits of it. And Tony, would love to hear your opinions too.
I think that we need to rethink the office space entirely, because in a hybrid environment, what we're going to have, and we're already seeing and people are struggling with, is a certain number of people present in the physical space and a certain number of people present virtually. And we need new kinds of solutions that allow for that kind of blended learning. I also think that the office will less and less be a space for personal knowledge production and more be a space for group knowledge production. So the whole question of open plan and desk, I think that those things are likely going to move to the background in terms of their importance. And what's going to come to the foreground is how might we increase the impact of having people physically together when we decide to make that investment, and how might we make it possible for people to be as equally telepresent as the people who are physically present in the office. And that, I think, is the real pressing challenge of the future. I think that there'll always be space for people who are doing individual knowledge production while they wait on the sidelines to enter into a group collaboration activity, but I don't think that there's any reason for anyone to go to the office in a hybrid work environment just to do individual knowledge work unless they have no physical space at home where they can do that productively. I also think that we'll see the physical office move from a single sort of locket, if you will, on a necklace to a strand of pearls. And we'll see increasingly, for those who don't work easily in their home environments, the sort of co-working spaces suddenly federated out into the suburbs and exurbs to allow offices that used to be all people in the city center to now be distributed across a broader area. And that will make, for instance, in the East Coast of the US, what come true, essentially, William Gibson's prediction that we would eventually have the Boston-Atlanta metropolitan axis. And I think that's the case, that there'll be a string of pearls and people all along it will be participating in things that are happening in center spaces where people are collaborating with lots of people distributed along the way and globally as well. A question came up, which I'll field since I happen to be speaking at the moment, which is how do you assure alignment from the wonderfully named Emily Spice with cross-functional teams versus specialty squads? And so what I would say, Emily, is the squad is generally a group of people who are a shared discipline functionally, for instance, analytics and data science. And the pod, the cross-functional team, is focused on a specific challenge. People are seconded from squads to work on pods or multiple pods to do that work together. What the squad gives is a community of practice and a commonality of tools and methods. And what the pod gives is focused cross-functional capabilities, tackling business challenges that really can't be dealt with serially with any pace. Is that a helpful answer?
There's another question, Tony, that's popped up around asking for a bit more from Angelique, asking for a bit more detail on what we consider elements, behaviors of play that we have placed on the highest transformation change level. I think that giving away your Lego expression is so central to that, because it's, and you talk to that, but I think we should build a little bit more on that. If you and Amanda.
Sure, I'm happy to take a stab at that and add a few. So, I think the idea of play, it's really, what's the opposite of play is this idea of stress and anxiety that we see at level 1. And so the opposite of that, play is where you really feel free, you feel excited about what's heading forward and comfortable in terms of what that path is. And so a few of the key kind of mindsets and behaviors that we can tie to that. One is really getting past this fear of failure. And that was something that we looked a lot at in our Catalyst research last year. And one of our key levers is celebrating successes and lessons learned. And we found that organizations were far more comfortable celebrating successes than really talking about lessons learned, but embracing this fear of failure and really having leaders role modeling that. So, debriefing what happened, talking about lessons learned, and then finding opportunities to work those back into the new paths and actions that we're taking going forward is absolutely critical. I think if you consider that team level and this idea of experimenting in cross-functional groups, Tony shared the example of how USAA reorganized themselves around the customer journey. And I think oftentimes we see that a powerful way to reorganize is outside in, really being very customer centric. And as part of that, being very empathetic. I think companies that are able to bring more of the voice of the customer into the room and really understand where their customers are coming from, that creates a powerful kind of anchoring point for individuals and teams from different parts of the organization to really work from there and use that as their North Star in terms of what's really motivating and guiding all of us to do the work. And then the last thing I would mention is building a little bit on the idea of learning agility, which we talked about for individuals. That's really powerful. And I think there's lots of different ways to do that. Some companies take a more formal orientation where you might rotate through different types of roles or have the opportunity to kind of craft what you believe your title should be based on the value that you bring to teams. And then there's opportunities to do that more informally too. So different communities of practice where employees can come together, not necessarily part of their day jobs, but really around what they're interested in. Spotify has different chapters related to areas of practice like software development, and they have things like guilds, which are related to interests like sustainability. So I think there's all sorts of both formal and informal mechanisms that you can build in to really help employees get comfortable with that idea of learning agility.
So there's another question that I spotted from Daniel in the context of the war for talent on will employer branding have a comeback in the context of organisations approaching employer as a service, which was a very hot question, and I'm sure I'll start that. And I imagine Erin, you might like to build on that one as well. I didn't realise employer branding kind of had lost its way, because it's certainly not what we're finding. It absolutely more than ever is part of that DNA setting that we talked about as the sort of control tower in our human-centered transformation model. So actually we are seeing organizations taking it more seriously than ever, and actually being really and that was starting as we went into the last 18 months, and we have many clients have placed an even higher priority on it. Obviously, there's all sorts going on in the world at the moment around the war for talent, because that certainly is a hot topic, and kind of I've read a lot about the Great Resignation, and there's a lot of people who have a view that actually it was pent up. It was a pent up situation. People actually sat tight for a longer period of time than might have normally happened, and that actually has fueled something that is playing out right now. But I think, unfortunately, I think it also comes with a huge reconsideration of what people want from the context of their world of work and the future of work that their employer is pointing towards. So I love your question about employer as a service. I think there was a generation already thinking like that, and I think with some of the things that have come back onto the table now and the kind of shockwaves, I think, of this pent up shift, I think it's our own organization, is seeing some really interesting moves from its people as well. We really consider ourselves to have a extraordinary track record of of growing people joining and flourishing with us, we're seeing the patterns that everybody else is seeing. So I think there's some really interesting challenges about organizations really being clear on employee value proposition and in this future of work. And it goes back to some of the things that we talked about at the beginning about sustaining change and making sure that these employee experiences that are built for you to compete successfully in the war for talent are thought through very holistically. Erin, do you want to build on that?
My build was going to be pretty much your last sentence, whereas I think about conscious commitments and the empowering talent experiences, and that's sort of part of our research. I tend to agree with Helen, at least in my perspective of sort of the engagements that I've been on, the clients that I've worked with over the past 2 years. EVP has not been absent in those, even if it was initially a branding project. It was critical, right, that we think, well, what does this mean for your employees and how do we, credibly bring it to life? So it's been central to the conversations I've been having. I just wonder if it's a slightly different flavor in, as Helen was just saying, a more holistic perspective of you're not just attracting a professional, you're attracting a person. And, considering sort of all of what that means, both in and outside of an office, in and out of work, and the promises that you're trying to uphold from that perspective.
Thanks, Erin. Tony.
I was looking at another question from David Sanders, which he said, we've seen IT organizations moving from a project orientation to more of a product orientation. Do you see that happening across organizations? And I would say, yes. I'm not sure if you meant it only in IT organizations or if you meant more broadly in organizations, but both are true. So IT organizations have realized that the old mode of just maintaining stuff doesn't really work, and just doing a project and delivering something means that you end up with lots of legacy spaghetti. Many years ago, when I was an IT leader, I inherited an organization that had a $300 million spend and it had 300 systems. And you knew that some of those systems, some days I would just say, let's turn one off and see if anyone complains. So things cease being used and cease having relevance. And if there's 1 or 2 happy users and the organization has enough income, they just let it go. When you move to a product orientation, you get a much more continuous focus on the end customer or end user, and you get much more modern products and services from your IT organization. We're also seeing in the commercial sides of organizations, as technology is now just business, that product orientation in terms of the structure of commercial sides of businesses is critical, and seeing what they do as being products that need to be constantly in touch with the market, constantly in touch with the end user, whether it's a product or a service, and having that continuous release mode that comes with Agile is something that we're seeing move across organizations more broadly. If you're interested, you can look either on Medium or on LinkedIn. Mike Welch and I wrote a piece a few years back after we did some transformation work for a large technology firm about a model called DERPA, which are the capabilities that we see necessary for product development: design, engineering, research, product management, analytics, and data science. And we're continuing to write about that stuff. Also, if you just want to know more, feel free to reach out. So the short answer, yes. The long answer, you just got. There was another question which I thought maybe Erin, Amanda, Helen, you guys might be interested, from Kay, which is how well understood, embraced by organizations is that broader concept of productivity, which includes areas like interaction, breaking down of hierarchies, silos, that sort of thing. I'm wondering if one of you wants to go for that one.
I can offer some perspective. What I would say in my experience with our clients is that the idea of working cross-functionally and breaking down silos as a way of increasing productivity and really innovation too is embraced by organizations, but oftentimes harder in practice to actually make that happen. I feel like at the beginning of many of our engagements, when we're doing our immersion and discovery, that tends to be one of the key challenges that is being raised to us in terms of really leaders looking for ways to make some progress against that. So one of the things that I think in our experience has proven to be effective is beginning to pull in more agile ways of working. Even if the entire organization isn't moving to a full agile methodology, I think there's some rituals that you can begin to borrow from agile, things like a daily stand-up, for instance, really kind of checking in and understanding the barriers that are in the way of someone making progress, or doing a regular retrospective. We do them typically every 2 weeks in our work at Profit, where we're really asking ourselves, what did we do that helped the work? What hindered the work, and what do we want to improve going forward? And so these are some of the ways that you're including kind of leaders and employees in the same conversation, beginning to break down that hierarchy and really trying to move forward in a way that everyone is aligned on what we want to work on together. The last thing I would add is from last year's research, and actually the year before, those levers of change that Helen introduced, the one that leaders wish that they had done more of in hindsight, it's a fundamental, but they found that they had a really hard time within their organization, was pushing decision rights downward. And so that's really critical as well to empowering those employees who are actually closest to the work, to the decisions being made. And the one kind of key that we have found in terms of how organizations can make progress in pushing decision rights downward are those organizations that have begun to apply some more of the agile rituals into their ways of working.
I'm conscious of time, so I will just make one very quick point, because this, I think, is a huge discussion, because unfortunately so many organizations attribute productivity to merely outputs. And I think when you read through our Catalyst research of the last couple of years, and also the 2021 report, you will see a kind of steady kind of drumbeat of, particularly in relation to things like experimentation and building organizational resilience, in the need to celebrate progress as opposed to simply outcomes. And it's just an enormous topic. Incentives often is in the mix here as well. The picture we see, unfortunately, is pretty fragmented across many of our clients. So, but it's huge, big hot topic for sure. Right, I'm really conscious of the last 2 minutes. So, Tony, I think we were going to move to some final slides. Yeah.
Yeah. I feel badly that we didn't answer Wolfgang's question about what we can learn from cultural practitioners that have taken the wrong path. I think the simple and rather tongue-in-cheek answer is don't do that, right? So all the things that we've espoused are the opposite of other things. Set up silos, leave people in roles forever, try to pursue goals functionally instead of cross-functionally, work in waterfall. Right, and there are plenty of firms pursuing all of those things right now because they're not really ready for changing. So you can download the full report from a link in the chat. Please feel free to reach out to any of us. This will be available for replay. Nicola will also send out the deck that we used. Our final question, which we'd love to know from you, is it's that time for us to start thinking about 2022. And now you've got a sense of the trajectory of the Catalyst's work. We'd love to know any suggestions that you might like us to pursue as we think about our research for next year. So if there's anything that you would like us to be thinking about in 2022, if you could drop that right now into the chat, the sort of topics. Yes, Eli, you'll get a link to watch again. Any of the topics you'd like us to cover in 2022 or in blog posts, based on what you've seen, we'd love to know what those are. It's a great way for us to get a pulse about what's on people's minds. Anybody? Bueller, got any ideas for us for 2022?
Or you could actually, because you will see our email addresses, you are very welcome also to email us with any thoughts. So, because I'm just conscious that time is precious, yes, and we've had our full hour. So thank you very much for joining us. We hope you've enjoyed it. We hope we've given you plenty of food for thought, and we hope we'll see you again in some shape or form going forward. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your time. You just come back.